Welcome to Earth Month programming, and thank you to all the panelists here for this great session that is coming up. We also want to welcome our online audience as well. So good morning and good afternoon. I am Joyce Lee, President of Indigo JLD Green Health, and we have been running Earth Month and Earth Day events for 2 years now during my tenure as chair of the Environment Climate Network. We have over 15 educational sessions, such as this one, open to the public, covering topics such as energy, collections, exhibitions, facilities, carbon and waste, green teams, retail and food services in museums. And number two, our quarterly green coffee hours have tackled many opportunities and constraints in green practices among our community. 3, our support of the exhibition materials pledge has been launched with other nonprofits to green more exhibits. And 4, our work with the U.S. Green Building Council resulted in LEED for museum guidance so that you can earn LEED certifications more easily. It is also available to the public. On the international front, we held a circumpolar virtual seminar during COP26 in Scotland with countries near the Arctic Circle. And of course, including our friends in the US, Canada, and all the Nordic countries where climate change is accelerating. And then we collaborated with ICOM Austria to move the dial on UN Sustainable Development Goals called the SDGs with an impersonal event in New York. Today, thanks to Kate Tallman and AAM, we have a focus on historic houses and museums, understanding their missions and challenges, which you'll hear a lot of. It will be an hour very well spent, I hope. And we also hope that you will join us for our final program next week on the 18th. So with that, I will turn over to Lauren Bufford.
Hi, this is Lauren Bufford. I'm the director of the Parthenon Museum in Nashville, Tennessee. It's my pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much, Kate, for asking me and including me. We have some great panelists today. I'm going to give them a brief introduction and then we'll turn it over to them for discussion. We'll have a Q&A session afterwards. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A. First up, I'm going to introduce Peter Ruth, the Executive Director of the Mark Twain House. Peter has a 39-year career in museums and historic preservation in New York and New England. He holds an MA from the Cooperstown program and a BA in anthropology from Drew. During his career, he has been on staff at such museums as Historic Hudson Valley, Sturbridge Village, and the Newport Historical Society. In 1998, Peter was named as the first museum director of the Newport Restoration Foundation, which holds historic properties, collections of European fine and decorative arts, and a major collection of Newport furniture. During his tenure, he created the first national conference on climate change and historic preservation. Keeping History Above Water is now in its 7th year, hosted by different museums and preservation organizations. Peter is now the executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum, the national landmark at which Twain wrote most of his best-known work. It is visited annually by over 70,000 people from every state in the US and 60 to 65 countries around the world. Rodney Rowland joins us as Director of Special Projects and Facilities at Strawbery Banke Museum. Rodney Rowland first joined Strawbery Banke, the living history museum in downtown Portsmouth, New Hampshire, as a volunteer in 1976 and joined the staff in 1990. His involvement has always focused on the preservation and long-term sustainability of this important historic site. He is currently responsible for the 37 buildings on the 9-acre site, overseeing the properties and restoration department, and is the project manager for various projects. Strawbery Banke is engaged in many projects that may physically extend beyond the museum property, but that impact the future of the museum and engage every one of the visitors to the site. One example of an ongoing project is Strawbery Banke's work since 2013 with the city of Portsmouth, exploring how predicted sea level rise will affect Portsmouth's built geography. Shantia Anderhagen, the principal at Preservation Strategies. She has over 35 years of experience in historic preservation and cultural resource identification and protection, holding staff and leadership positions in local, regional, and national nonprofit organizations, Historic New England, National Trust for Historic Preservation, and the Newport Restoration Foundation, as well as local government in Newport, Rhode Island. She has served on numerous boards and commissions focused on historic preservation, cultural resources, architectural history, and local history. Since 2018, Shantia has been consulting as the principal of Preservation Strategies with an expertise in historic preservation, project management, as well as the use of preservation and conservation easements to protect historic properties and land. Her clients include statewide nonprofits, nonprofit historic sites, private property owners, architects, and others. I'd like to welcome you all here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Peter to provide us with an overview of what we're going to discuss.
Sure. We've all known each other, Shantia and Rodney and I, for a while, and we really have a deep experience in this subject, and we hope that you're going to gain from it today. Our plan today is to sort of do a rapid fire introduction to this subject. We could rattle on for 12 hours about this easily. But we want to do kind of a rapid fire introduction that's about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for Q&A afterwards, because none of us have ever done one of these where there weren't a lot of questions. So please keep track of your questions in the Q&A session, in the Q&A section, and we'll look forward to trying to answer them later. As noted, in 2016, Shantia and I founded the Keeping History Above Water Conference. It was the first conference about the confluence of climate change and historic preservation. And this is when we were at the Newport Restoration Foundation in Rhode Island. That franchise has been going on for 7 years and is still owned by the foundation, but it moves from place to place. And so, more to the point, Rodney is hosting the latest iteration in Portsmouth, and he will rightfully and shamelessly be promoting that a little bit. So we'll look forward to hearing that. And I urge you to go. These conference sessions are great, and you really get a chance to dive into this subject in greater depth. So with that, I'm going to go to the slides. And give me just a second here. And we're ready to start. There's always this thing, and you'll hear it on the news sometimes, that climate change isn't coming, it's here, and it really is here. This is, both of these slides are Vermont. This was Hurricane Irene, and it devastated the state. It's in places that you would not necessarily expect. The slide on the left is southeastern France, which experienced record wildfires last year, and on the right is in Great Britain. It's all over the place. We've been hearing about flooding pretty regularly in Asia. Of course, there was terrible riverine flooding in Central Europe a few years back, and it's a little obscured on my screen, but you can see a completely dried lake bed in California, and we've been hearing about that for the last couple of years. We all know that this is a global phenomenon, but really, who expected a green and rainy England to be drought-ridden and plagued by wildfires? Who expected France to be that way? So we're going to talk a little bit about this today. So I think there's a real expectation that if you're on the coast, that climate risk certainly applies to you and your site. But if you're elsewhere and not maybe directly on a river, does it apply to you? And the answer is, yeah, it pretty much applies to all of us all the time. And if it's not applying directly to you now, then it will be applying to you, because this is a very dynamic situation. And if it's obscured on the lower right, you can't have me speak at this point and not get a Mark Twain quote out of it. So this one was upon the announcement of his bankruptcy, he wrote a letter to his wife saying, "Cheer up, the worst is yet to come." So let's talk a little bit about 5 things that I want you to remember as we go through this session. The physical effects of climate change are really it's sort of the visible part of the iceberg. There are a host of other issues, financial issues, insurance being one of them, risk management issues, and those are just a couple of the problems. Climate change impacts are societal as well as physical. Climate change itself doesn't care about what we refer to as climate justice, but we do. If there's a choice about which neighborhood is going to get saved in a coastal community, the lower income area has a smaller chance. So thinking about climate justice is important. If you think about gentrification, if you think about gentrification as a preservation problem, this is actually much bigger. In another sense, what happens when a whole community must be abandoned? Shifting populations and their impact on cultural communities it may already be profound in certain areas. You can think about that in coastal South Carolina, but it will affect everyone in the long run. There is no end within our site. As I say here, inertia is a bitch. If we did everything that we have identified that scientists tell us we need to do to stop climate change in its tracks right now, which we're not doing, but if we did everything, there is enough inertia literally baked into the system that the general opinion is it would take 400 to 500 years to get back to where we are today. So even if we do everything right, it's not going to stop dead in its tracks. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Saving historic fabric has to involve new thinking. So this is a place where we'd love to entertain questions later. We cannot think that preservation and building maintenance strategies of the past are going to suffice in a rapidly changing system. Historic preservation tenets in particular must adapt. We cannot be frozen in amber anymore. Old buildings have adapted over the centuries, and they're really going to have to adapt quickly in order to survive. It's a matter of preserving what we can and not being hidebound about our approach anymore. And the last point here is that there's no historical reference point. For all of recorded human history, environmental changes have been relatively slow and steady, but we can't rely on those old reference points. They're about to change, and very quickly. So, okay, that was about as gloomy a forecast as I can give you. So let's be positive for a moment. What are 5 things that you can do? And I know Rodney is going to talk about this as a case study, so this is really good. Partner with others. Who else? We're all small. Even the biggest of us are still small. So who can you partner with? Municipalities, organizations that are focusing on this, other museums, professional organizations, like this is an AAM program. Plan. This is a dynamic situation, and we're all going to talk a little bit about this. Become an expert in thinking how this situation is going to affect your site and plan for it. And you may have to rehearse for it as well. Public outreach, educate your community. We're museums, we're historic sites. We are educational by nature. So how can you educate people on your site about this situation? And the last one is to use history as a touch point. If people knew that Ellis Island could eventually be flooded and unvisitable, they would be alarmed by that. How can you use your own site to educate people what's going to happen here? How could this be gone? It can start to make them less blasé about climate change. It might make them wake up and smell the coffee. How can you use things that are historical, things that have been reference points for the general public for generations, for thousands of years even? How can you make them think differently about it by using history as a touchstone? And with that, we're going to Shanti next. So,
Okay. How's that? Everybody see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Well, I'm a little, okay. Hi, thank you all for joining today. This is a real sign in Bristol, Rhode Island. Went up a few years ago, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago. And I notice it every week because when I was a child in Rhode Island, you never saw stuff like this. So I'm going to talk as quickly as I can about assessing risk, hazards, and impacts. Peter has established that climate change is real and it's here. And it's also now abundantly clear that developing resilience against climate change is dependent on a significant amount of money, many partners, and local community input, action, vision. And because, quite frankly, the financial burden to address climate change is so enormous, no one property owner or organization or community, can go it alone. It's going to take help from all sorts of sources, local, state, federal. And all the decisions that we make about our historic sites will contribute to solving or perpetuating climate change. So the first step is to assess the risks presented by climate change. I'm going to quickly run through some of the information that you should assemble to understand and strategize for the vulnerabilities that you are likely to face. The largest asset that most organizations own is real estate, and any uncertainty in real estate is a big problem. It impacts owners, insurers, municipalities, investors, lenders. So doing everything we can to eliminate that uncertainty is pretty important. Assessing risk is critical to understanding what may happen in the future, both near term and longer. So where do you start? Well, you start by assembling physical and legal facts about the resources that you have. When was your site built, your buildings built, restored? What's the total square footage you're dealing with? How many stories of buildings are you dealing with? Is topography and soil? What's your site hold in terms of topography and soil? The material types and physical condition of your buildings. Foundation, structural framing, siding. One of the important things to identify and understand is your lowest opening, lowest elevation. It's called LAG, or lowest adjacent grade elevation, which identifies when water surface elevation is likely to start damaging your building. I understand that there are many impacts, and we're going to be hazards and impacts. We're going to talk about those in a second, but here in New England, primarily we are dealing with water. So you'll hear that infused in my discussion. Historic designations and significance. What is the architectural significance of the properties you own, your historical significance? And finally, know your zoning. And I know that Rodney is going to talk about some other aspects that are important to consider. So what is risk? FEMA describes risk as the potential loss associated with a hazard, defined in terms of expected probability and frequency. The estimated impact that a hazard would have on people, services, facilities, and structures. As Peter mentioned, we're talking about a range of impacts, not just what's going to happen physically with a building. It's often expressed in relative terms such as high, moderate, or low likelihood of sustaining damage. And this is why it's really important to identify what you have and what its vulnerabilities are. Hazard. FEMA describes hazard as a physical or an event or physical condition that has the potential to cause fatalities, injuries, property damage, some of the other things that we've already talked about. And I should mention that I'm using these definitions from FEMA because it's a good sort of national benchmark source. I'm sure the insurance industry has other specific definitions of these things, but in terms of the work we do, we often look to FEMA to help us define these things. So the types of hazards and hazard events. What are your known and potential hazards? Of course, we hear a lot in the news about sea level rise because our country is surrounded by water, but there are many other hazards depending on your geographic location, as Peter so adeptly illustrated in some of his photographs. You need to determine what the known hazards are for where you are and what are the likely and potential hazards. What historically have been the hazards. We've heard mention already here in New England, we have sea level rise, but one of the other water events is the increasing rain that we have. The ferocity of the rain is amazing, as Peter's already mentioned. So, you know, that is one that 10 years ago we weren't really talking about, and now we are. There's also surrounding activity to consider, things that are going on around you that may be directly impacted themselves and then have a direct impact on you. Things like power plants, oil refineries, mines, dams. You really need to look quite comprehensively around you. So you have all kinds of hazards that are listed on the screen, and then other things to consider as well. And what is impact? So the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk and Reduction defines impact, because I couldn't find a FEMA definition of impact, as an event or physical condition that has the potential to cause fatalities, etc., etc. Types of impact. Not all of these will apply to your property or your organization, but many will. Things like property damage, inventory loss, if you're a museum, your shop, loss of business revenues, personal property losses, displacement. If your buildings are damaged, where are you going and how are you paying for it? Loss of life, obviously. And then indirect impacts are all kinds of things, including, I think Rodney is going to talk a bit about this, but insurance. You know, we're seeing flood insurance rates that are unmanageable in many places. Job losses, losses of employee wages. We don't always consider these indirect impacts, but they are actually very important to the sustainability of any organization. So just to reiterate, hazards lead to impacts. By the way, these lists came from the Smithsonian Institution that has a pretty good, is a pretty good resource for organizations that have buildings and collections. So you assess your hazards and what impacts they're going to have. There are increasingly good models out there for how to assess climate change risks. All you really need is the Google, honestly. There are more and more helpful and enlightening case studies and models out there on which you can base your work. I'm showing you two good ones here. The state of North Carolina's Climate Risk Assessment and Resilient Plan is pretty impressive. And Historic Environment Scotland has done a study of all of its properties that is quite, quite compelling. These can get very, very complicated, but it's better to have more to consider as opposed to missing something very important in your own assessment. And so back to water. So many historic properties and sites are located along coasts that you should know whether you're in a flood zone, and if so, what type. You need to understand FEMA's flood zone designation, velocity, and stages. You should know whether your land, the land you are on, is sinking, which can occur simultaneously as bodies of water around you are rising. I think Rodney may be covering a bit of this in his discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, when defining risk, a thorough analysis of vulnerabilities will also calculate your identified risks using a cost magnitude matrix. That is, what's the total financial cost to addressing your vulnerabilities? The city of Annapolis, actually, Maryland, developed a matrix that measures risk from very low, under $5,000, to very high, over $100,000. With medium risk cost being between $10,000 and $50,000. Finally, risk analysis models should assess more than the threats to buildings, properties, landscapes. They should assess artifacts, collections, as I said, employment loss. There are lots of things to consider in this risk assessment process. And I know that Peter will be addressing some of this. To conclude, I mentioned at the start that no one can go this alone. It's critical to identify who to partner with and who to work with. So evaluating risk happens really at a community level as well. What work is already underway in your community and who is doing that work? What tools are available to help you locally? Comprehensive planning, which is mandated by law in many, many states. Are the cultural and historic resources considered? Is climate change considered? At this point, I would say very much so, but it's good to get involved in that process. It can have a big impact on your property. Hazard mitigation planning identifies the major threats and action to improve those vulnerabilities or address those vulnerabilities, to build resilience, to respond. So some of that work may already have been done in your community, and you can then apply it to your action plan. And it's important to be involved in that because you want to make sure that historic and cultural resources are inventoried and planned for in your community's hazard mitigation planning. And then some communities are doing further planning called resilience planning. Similar questions. Has it considered your property and the historic resources within the community? And now I'll pass it on to Peter.
So this section of the talk is really partially designed for those of you who may not be having a big problem right now. As noted, I am the executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum, which is located in north central Connecticut. It's fairly close to the Massachusetts border. We are 44 miles from the coast. We're more than 100 feet above mean high water on Long Island Sound. So we're not in a coastal zone. We are probably not in a riverine flooding zone, and I'll explain the probably in just a moment. But the Connecticut River, which is much more of a threat than the ocean, is still 2.4 miles away, and we're still over 100 feet higher than that. We are currently, and once again, I will explain the currently in here. We are currently unlikely to experience, it should say unlikely there, unlikely to experience serious wind damage from hurricanes. We are currently not in a serious, that should say not in a serious tornado zone. Sorry about that. FEMA actually rates us in the relatively low category. So what vexes us here from climate change? The biggest thing that vexes us right now may not be the biggest thing that vexes us in another 20 or 30 years. But the biggest thing right now is major rain events. You can see the sort of nightmare icicle on the right side of your screen. And although that's not liquid water, I'm using it to highlight the fact that most historic buildings were not designed to cope with the levels of water, either in terms of their roofing or in terms of their drainage and the site drainage. So that can become a serious problem. This relatively placid looking path on the left was hit by a rainstorm about a year ago, a little over a year ago, that was so ferocious that it literally washed out, the entire path, and cost us about $3,000 to fill it back in. We are looking at more drainage problems all the time. As I noted, Southern New England has experienced, I noted in our intro, not to the audience yet, Southern New England, which is one of the most rapidly warming parts of the country, has experienced a 74% increase over the last 30 years. That's not a long time. In major rain events. A major rain event is defined as more than an inch in 24 hours. You can see much worse than that, though. In 2010, areas of Rhode Island received 15 inches in 26 hours. So there's a whole lot of damage that can do. And we're seeing that kind of nightmare happening increasingly. It's also, it's a matter of wind-driven rain, too. We're often seeing these major rainstorms coming along with wind-driven rain slanting in at a diagonal and finding all sorts of spaces that would not normally be the case in these historic structures. And water will find its way in. So this is something that we have to think about increasingly. Now, those are just storms. If you're my age, in your 60s, or even in your 50s, you probably remember that when you were a kid, the rain came for a quarter of an inch, and it would rain a little bit, and then a couple of days later, maybe you'd have another little rainstorm. It was a nice little soaker. It kept everything green and pleasant. But increasingly in this part of the country, those rain events are happening less frequently, and when we do get rain, it's much more extreme, and that's completely climate driven. And so the ground has less ability to absorb these major rains, and instead it runs off, and it causes all sorts of problems. So another risk that we have is that a river used to run through here. It was called the Park River, and it doesn't anymore. It was put underground, but it's still there. It's just in a conduit underneath our parking lot. Do we still face a risk from that? I don't know. That's why I said in the slide before that we probably are okay. The other point, and this is an indirect thing, is that energy rates are increasing. In Connecticut this year, they gave us a really unpardonable 100% increase in our electric costs. And here's our expensive beast outside that costs us money whenever we turn it on, for the benefit of both the people and the collections inside the museum building. So the energy needs are changing because things are getting warmer and they're getting more humid. So we're turning this stuff on more frequently. So what are some of the solutions to this? Better drainage and erosion control. This is a project that we got grant funding for from a local foundation about 4 years ago. But this hillside was eroding, and a large portion of that was due to rain. And this has solved the problem. So there are solutions to some of these. An engineering study for the Park River probably doesn't require a study, really. It requires an experienced engineer to say, no, you're really not facing this problem in this particular location. Where the thing goes into the conduit, they may be facing a problem, but you're not. I suspect that's the answer. And as far as rising energy costs, you can see from the right, we have a very recent proposal to look at a solar carport. We're actually going to be hearing a little bit more about that in a meeting a little later today. But we think that we can meet 104% of our energy needs with a solar carport down in our parking lot. It seems to be the best solution for us. We're looking at the possibility of putting some of it on the museum building, which is only 20 years old, which may increase our energy capability to 120% of what we actually need. Why is that important? Because we may need more energy to run that air conditioner later on as things heat up more. And with that, I'm always fond of Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson always has an interesting observation to make, and I think this is a good one for all of climate change. What you see today is not tomorrow's situation. We have grown accustomed over the last 3,000 years to a relatively slow incremental change, and that's not the case anymore. So think about what it's going to be like 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years from now. And with that, I'm going to bounce over to Rodney.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to share my screen.
Oh yeah, and let me unshare mine.
Okay. So I'm going to be real quick because we're running a little bit behind our agenda. First, by introduction, Strawbery Banke Museum is a 9-acre site in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the banks of the Piscataqua River. It's pretty much the entire center of this image. Obviously, the Piscataqua River, it plays a factor in what we're talking about today. It is a tidal river. What you should also know is that large green lawn that you see extending back from the forefront all the way back used to be a tidal inlet called Puddle Dock. That was filled in by the city of Portsmouth in 1903, and that too plays a big factor in the conversation we're having today. Strawbery Banke is very much like I'm sure many museums you visited. We are a historic site with 37 historic structures. One thing that makes us different is most of our buildings are on their original foundations. So the 3 buildings at the top of the screen are in their original locations. The earliest one in the center built in 1695 on that spot. So our goal is to show you the evolution of this neighborhood through time using the historic structures and also period gardens across our 9-acre site. So looking at an 1813 view of or map of Portsmouth, you can see the dock in the center. So that's that waterway, that tidal inlet that I spoke of earlier. And in this image, you can see the FEMA flood projections superimposed over a city of Portsmouth flood map. And it sort of mimics what you see in the 1813 map. So when we say that Strawbery Banke water has a memory, we're talking about how the low areas that have been claimed over time are the most vulnerable. And unfortunately, that includes a large portion of Strawbery Banke and many of our historic structures. And as you can see the results, these are images over the last 5 years. We have incredible surface water issues. Those larger and larger rain events that Peter and Shanti alluded to are plaguing us. Without having that outflow to the river, which we had historically, all the water ends up on our site in just ponds in and around our buildings. And that water eventually gets into our basements. And this is a 2-pronged issue, because not only is the surface water finding its way into our basements when it reaches our foundations, but the groundwater we're seeing is rising. And that's due to the fact that the Puddle Dock tidal inlet, when filled in, caused a huge amount of displacement. They put hundreds and hundreds of tons of soil and other materials on that water. And so that tide still comes and goes twice a day and is now pushing into the building envelopes. But that rising damp also causes huge humidity levels. And that, as you all know, causes insect issues and mold and mildew issues and is a danger not to only to the fabric of the building, but the decorative arch collection we have. People talk about the 100-year storm. This was ours in 1991. We kind of projected that we could fill up Puddle Dock so that it looked like it did historically. And as you can see, that in fact occurred when this hurricane dumped 5 to 6 inches of water on our site in a matter of a few hours. So this is our worst case scenario and what we're working feverishly to avoid in the future. We established a sea level rise initiative. It was part of a capital campaign that was to deal with both the groundwater issues in specific buildings, the surface water issues that I spoke of earlier. But then the big key piece of it is education and public outreach. That's really important to us. We feel that if we're going to have to go through this process and learn what to do, that we should share with others, because as has been noted, this is not our problem alone. It is many, many problems for many, many people. We've been going through this process of a stormwater master plan. This is a sort of a management plan for the entire site to make sure that that ponding that's occurred ends up where we want it to go. Our partners in this are Placeworks and Horsley Witten. This one actually just came out last week, draft of our plan. I am sharing it with permission. We eventually will have it online for people to reference as well. And it basically looks at our entire site, discovering where water comes from, where it ends up, what utilities, what structures are available for water management, what their limitations are, and what we can do to get the water to go where we want it to go. I can't speak enough about the partnerships that we have to do this. Strawbery Banke could not do this alone. It takes engineers, architects, lots of minds. We established a community advisory group that specializes in this kind of thing, but also includes people who are familiar with our mission so that we can blend some of the solutions with the interpretation of our historic site. That was enormous. And obviously the city of Portsmouth. They have to be our partners, and they are, as you'll see, a very big partner. The plan identifies areas of concern. Those are some of the images that I've shared with you earlier. Each one of these areas will be then broken out into possible solutions and tools we can use to mitigate some of those water hazards. These are some of the options available to us depending on what is causing the flooding: reducing the water, controlling it, capturing it, storing it, and then the overflow. Ultimately, we're going to need that outflow back into the river that we had historically, because we can only manage so much water. And that's when the city of Portsmouth really is going to have to help us. One of the exciting opportunities is looking at the history of our site and understanding that Puddle Dock used to be a tidal inlet with a number of 16th and 17th century wharves projecting out into that water that the early settlers used. And so the opportunity is maybe as we create a water retention area, we could recreate some of those wharves and a beautiful walkway for our visitors that will have signage that talks about that history. And so we can kind of do both at the same time, take care of our stormwater issues, but also honor our mission of being a historic site and talk about our history. Yet another partnership is with the University of New Hampshire, the Geospatial Science Center. They are helping us understand how groundwater is moving around our site and ultimately around the city of Portsmouth. This kiosk will be installed in our gallery this spring, and it will give visitors an opportunity to see exactly where the groundwater is moving and when it is impacting our historic buildings. And ultimately, of course, we'll need to raise money for this. So the stormwater management plan will have design boards that will talk about those areas of concern individually, possible solutions, and some sort of idea of cost. And this is what we can take to our donor base. The education and outreach piece, as I said, is a huge part for us. We opened an exhibit in our gallery 2 years ago. It will be up for 1 more year. We have been modifying that gallery exhibit through time as we've learned new things and implemented new solutions or found new problems. This is an enormous partnership with the city of Portsmouth. That Think Blue, What Can You Do is one of their initiatives funded by the EPA. The EPA requires them to spend a certain percentage of that money on public outreach. The city of Portsmouth is not very good at public outreach, but Strawbery Banke is. With an annual visitation of over 100,000 people, we can be the voice for the city. So here we are asking the city for help, but in return, we can help them. And that's really important for a partnership. We've also got partnerships with the Rockingham Planning Commission and the city of Portsmouth to put signage on city streets so that both tourists and residents are aware of flood-prone areas and what that could mean for the future. And then finally, being part of the Keeping History Above Water conversation. I can't speak more highly of this conference. I've been attending since the second one. I've spoken at, well, this one coming up in May will be my fourth. The opportunity to share our stories and learn what we're doing together has really helped me figure out a path through the impacts that we're seeing at Strawbery Banke. So I hope if you can join us, you will. And if you can't join us at ours, then look for future Keeping History Above Water conferences, because they will happen 2 to 3 times a year at this point. They're so popular. So with that, I will throw it back to Peter.
Okay. And there we go. So I'm going to run through this fairly quickly because we do want to get to the Q&A. And Shanti has already covered a little bit of this, but we're not here to talk about your individual disaster plans today. But when you think about collections and buildings, once again, think about what the causes are. And so I've listed some specific ones there. We haven't talked about fire so much today because none of us are Westerners, but wildfire is a huge thing out west, and certainly affects historic sites just as it affects all buildings. But what we want you to do is think about making climate change a part of your disaster planning scenario and put it into practice. When I was at Newport Restoration Foundation, we would view a tropical storm as a hurricane, partly to protect our properties, but that level of storm we knew wasn't going to hurt us very much. In reality, it was a way of rehearsing our hurricane preparedness in real time. If you have the chance, even as a tabletop exercise, to rehearse these things, then you should go ahead and do it. You need to consider how your site and its building might be affected and understand how you might mitigate that impact through planning. You need to create a list of necessary supplies. You need to keep them on hand. You need to inventory them annually. And a few things that you should think about as well, and then we'll go to the Q&A, is your insurance agent creative in thinking about risk management? How can a disaster impact your earned income? That was mentioned a little earlier, but we should mention it again. You should find out what plans your community has. Rodney just spelled out very clearly that they work hand in glove with the city of Portsmouth. You should know what your community has. It's one of the weird things about climate change, that things like flooding are considered to be a local issue. Things like wildfire are considered to be a local issue in many cases. And municipal government is the least prepared size of government to deal with a global issue. And yet, it's your local municipality that's supposed to deal with all of this flooding. You should look at loans and whether you're in a flood zone, as Shanti has said before. And so with that, I think we'd like to turn it over to question and answer.
Peter,
yeah.
I have just a short section on resources.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So are you done sharing? And I'll quickly share.
I'm sharing.
And I'll get through this very fast. Okay. And again, seems to be that it's not holding where I need to start. I'm sorry about that. So I'm gonna run through very, very quickly what some resources are for how to address many of the things that we've been talking about. In 2014, when Keeping History Above Water was being planned nearly a decade ago now, it was a hunt to identify who was working with cultural and historic resources and climate change. There is now so much information. Really, again, all you need to do is consult the Google. The problem now is often more about sorting through the amount of information, and quite importantly, has been pointed out, is keeping current, because things are changing all the time. So I'm only going to give you, high up sources that sort of relate to historic buildings, but you can find a lot of information online now. The National Park Service for the past 15 years or so has paid attention. It's the National Park Service that sets the standards and guidelines for how many of us are treating and working with historic and cultural resources. So it's important to know what the Park Service has done. And two important publications are the Illustrated Guidelines for Sustainability and Guidelines on Flood, which came out in 2011 and 2019, 2021, digital and then paper. There are also coastal communities such as Charleston, Newport, Annapolis, done a lot of work in their communities to address things like sea level rise. Organizations like Strawbery Banke, as Rodney has shared. And nationally, along with the federal government, organizations like the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, and US ICOMOS all have information and are pretty active. So you will not have a problem finding resources or models, I am certain. And so now we're ready to do question and answer. Sorry to speed through that, but it's important that we get to this.
That's okay. We don't have any questions and answers yet in the chat, but I have a question of my own. And if this is really to any of you, what do you think the biggest asset is that museums bring to the sustainability movement?
Well, certainly one thing is what I mentioned before, is that whether people care about history and historic structures, they're used to the permanence of them. They're used to the fact that that old house or the Statue of Liberty or Independence Hall has been around for a long time. And they're not used to the concept that it could disappear, that something could go wrong. And so I find that there's a great value in being able to bring that up and say, might not be here soon. And that jars people a little bit. And I think this is, in some cases, an issue about jarring people into wakefulness.
I think we also, go ahead.
No, go on, Rodney.
I think we also offer, as I mentioned, a voice. Even if for us, it's, a chance for the city of Portsmouth to talk about their initiatives in mitigating and protecting stormwater in the Piscataqua River. But in general, people have come to museums to learn and be educated and find out about history. Now, all of a sudden, we have an opportunity to learn about climate change and how working together as a community, we can help ourselves. So I think that's a great opportunity for us.
And I would just add very quickly that the materiality of our historic resources in this country, to a great extent, will survive in a different way than newer buildings will. So I think it's important to understand how the material nature of our buildings works and why that's important in terms of sustainability, because it really is. Historic materials, to a great extent, pre-20th century, are very, very long lasting, even in light of some of the impacts that we're having.
We had a house in Newport that was very close to the waterfront, and it was one that we purchased and restored. And we knew that it had been through major storms in 1815, 1938, and a whole slew of them in between. And yet, a lot of the historic fabric of that house was largely intact. The water had come in, and then it had gone out, and the building was fine afterwards. It's a lot of the more modern systems that we have problems with. So one way of making a building more resilient, for instance, is not having your mechanicals in the basement, but putting them up on the second floor. These days you can do that with your furnace. You can do that with your electrical, and not having them in flood-prone areas of the building.
Thanks. I'm just gonna let folks know that the chat is disabled. So if you have questions, just use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I did have one more question that came through. Let me just find it. One of our listeners asked if any of the museums had done net zero exhibitions to lower carbon.
I could tell you about one project, and if you happen to be going to AAM next month, we're presenting there. It's called Culture Over Carbon. It was a New England Museum Association grant from IMLS, and it was to study the carbon footprint of the cultural sector in the entire United States. And basically, we asked institutions to provide energy data that it would be electric, natural gas, oil, to a building science consultant that provide informational sheets on each of your structures on what the carbon footprint was for that structures and what could be done to help perhaps lessen that. So I think that's one of the first steps, is really understanding, how much energy we're using, how much carbon we're putting into the environment, and then we can react accordingly.
And, one of the reasons that we're excited about our solar project is, yes, it's going to positively help our bottom line. But as we try to adapt to climate change, we're also not contributing to it because we have our own solar array. So, we're doing something that's good for the planet. We're educating the public a little bit, and we're helping ourselves financially, because right now, after salaries and wages, utilities are the most expensive cost that I have on my budget. So.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add too that at the Parthenon, we are part of the Metro Parks Department, and we, with the other buildings that they're building, they are working to achieve LEED certification for many of those buildings. But I'm wondering now what can be brought into our building. I'm not sure we could ever be LEED certified, but what changes could we make? Could there be solar panels elsewhere in the park that would offset some of our electrical costs? Let's see.
I see we do have a couple of questions now.
Yeah, I'm gonna, we have time for two more. So do you see a role for museums and cultural institutions as advocates for climate change measures at all levels of government? I think you addressed this a little bit, Peter, but if anybody else wanted to add anything?
I very much see this, first of all, our audiences are receptive to this to begin with. So why not take the plunge and offer more information, talk about what your institution is doing. Under the last administration at Mystic, I'm not sure what they're doing with it now, but Mystic Seaport, they face huge sea level rise issues. Their interaction is humankind in the sea. And so they took a very interesting approach, which was to work with the town planners in towns immediately around Mystic to address their own issues as an infrastructure thing. And the third was as an educational thing. Let's talk about climate change. So.
Okay. This is a great question. Our museum is currently facing the challenge of moving our HVAC and other control systems off the ground floor or waterproofing them. Do you have any suggestions as to how we can engage our visitors in the process, especially if it means that we will have to close temporarily for construction? mean, I think we've seen examples from all of you about how to engage the public, but
I'm going to jump in and then I'll let the people who are really working in museums. But I want to say I have long, for my entire career, advocated for interpretation of preservation projects actively beyond what your general story of your historic site is. That I have watched for years as people turn from their museum tour and turn toward the conservator and say, what's going on there? People love that kind of action.
Right.
I heartily encourage full interpretation of these types of projects. And maybe Rodney and Peter have, more specific examples of how to do that. But I think it's a critically important interpretation and education opportunity.
yeah, and just to jump
really-
into, we have a preservation project going on site with some of the casts of the Parthenon marbles that were used to create the sculptures on the exterior of the Parthenon. It had to happen here. We couldn't move them out and back. And our curatorial and educational staff put up great labels. We've been able to exhibit some of the things we found or our conservator found inside, the casts, because we took them apart. And I think it's really one of the most exciting things we've done. It's sort of an exhibit unto itself, and a level of engagement with the museum and what happens in the museum every day. And I agree with you. I think when people see signage that they're not quite expecting, they're going to ask more questions.
Folks love to know how the sausage is made, and we make it, so we don't care about telling them a lot of the time, but we should. And yeah, I've done a lot of things along those lines, but in this case, I would suggest that there's still a great appetite. We do a huge number of virtual programming events here. It's not expensive to do that. You can put these things up on YouTube afterwards. Certainly a little signage outside the museum that intercepts people as they think they might like to come in and look at it. But the whole virtual programming thing opens up a lot of space if you're going to be closed. And we discovered that when we went into the pandemic, and we've literally had, at this point, probably somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people view our virtual programming, and none of it's about conservation. These are author talks, but it shows you what kind of interest can be out there and how you can still connect with your visitation, even though you're not open. So, and all you really need is, the laptop computer you're using right now and a Zoom account. It's not difficult to do.
Rodney, did you have anything to share?
I'll just add that we've been doing a guided tour on our site as part of our visitor experience. So as we adapt our houses or make infrastructure changes, we change that and include that in the tour. It culminates in the exhibit that we're hosting, but it gives people a really fresh look at what we're working on. We've made some adaptations to our gutters on our homes to accommodate more water. And so we talk a little bit about that. And the person leading the tour has some images of that work so that they can explain why it's being done.
And I have one other thing to say, and that is go to Rodney's conference, go to Keeping History of Water. You'll spend a whole conference talking about this, and you'll find all sorts of other people that are having exactly the same issues as you. If you're watching this right now, that conference is designed for you. Go for it. Or to another one. It is kind of a franchise at this point. So.
And you should know I did not pay Peter to say that.
No, you didn't. Yeah, but I'm the founder. I've got a little stake in the game here. I think it's important.
Well, it's a little past noon, so I think we need to wrap up. There is another session next week. I don't know if Joyce wants to say anything, but it's Race, Cultural Heritage, and Climate, looking to see the impact of climate change on historic buildings and structures that connect to people of color. Joyce, am I correct? Did I give the right information?
Yes, and we hope you can all join us. I want to have a big virtual applause for our panelists today and for Kate, who is organizing it. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.